Hilly hilly. Halli chumma. How are you? Hoyoish nim Kim Lahan. My name is Kim Lahan, and I'm here for our second session of the Chukchansi language class. This week we're going to start with an introduction from Chris Golston and just review kind of who's on our language team again. We're going to follow up on last week's materials, and we're going to look at our creation story for our second set. We're going to go over the history of Chukchansi language that's not kind of the far stuff, but more present, so 1800 to present, and then target words for this week and a mini spelling test. So this is our Fresno State language team. And on the far left is Nikin Adisasmido Smith next to Holly. And then we have Dr. Brian Agbayani and Dr. Chris Golston. And we're going to hear a little bit more from Chris.
Hello, everybody. Hoyowosh name Chris Golston, and I'm one of your linguists at Fresno State. I'm a dog guy and a Southwest guy from Albuquerque. Raised in New Mexico, but moved out to California a while back. I'm mostly German on my mom's side. That's my mom's hometown in middle of Germany. Went to college at Berkeley, where I studied Greek and Latin and also philosophy, and Hopi, which was super awesome and my first deep experience with Native American language. Went to grad school at UCLA, where I got a PhD in linguistics and studied Hittite, which is a picture of that there, and got to work on Upsaloga, otherwise known as Crow, a Siouan language spoken up in Montana. Where I was introduced to blueberry pudding and fry bread and other fantastic things like kidney on a stick. Came to Fresno State in 1996, and I've been working on Chukchansi since 2008, which has been awesome. I'm the one who made the writing system we use for Chukchansi, so if you hate it, you can blame it on me. I specialize in the sounds of Yokuts. And I'm writing a grammar for tribal members. Volume 1 is out, and Volume 2 should be out soon. You can email me anytime you have questions. I'm chrisg@csufresno.edu. Bye.
So we're going to follow up on last week's materials. So this past week, for the first week on the far past history, we had a Kahoot that we posted. So hopefully you got a chance to go in there and work on looking back and listening to the video and then seeing if you got the questions right on that. It's just kind of a fun activity to do. I posted the recording of the class, and then I also have the actual detail that Chris wrote it's really more in depth on the history. It's got a lot of really great detail. So if you're really into the history of things and how our language is part of the Yokuts family and the Penutian dialect, you could read that, and it really goes into more detail. I have the Quizlet that was posted. It was flashcards and kind of like pair matching for our terms from the story. And then a survey. We did a survey like, what's your availability for this class? So we did bump it up to 6:30 on Mondays just to have a little more time, give people time to eat dinner and get home from work and things like that. And then there was an audio, like spelling test that was available, and you could hear the word and then put in what you thought was the spelling for that. So it's supposed to not be cheating on that one. So just getting used to just practicing that oral sound to text on that one. So even if you got it wrong, just to try it on that one. That was the activity from last week. So all of those were there for you guys. Also, I added the dictionary, and it's the 2023 dictionary. And I put here the glottal stop just so that people can copy it. I just do control copy, and then when I'm typing things in, it's just ready. I could do control V or control paste, and you could use that glottal stop because I know it's not on your actual keyboard. So that's how my students get around it. They just copy and paste it when they need to, and it's just ready to go all the time. Also, the creation story text is there, so you could look at the detail, and then the ethnography for the cultural ethnography, which is really great to read through, and just there's so much information in that about ceremonies and just the way that we would handle different events in life. So really cool to read through that stuff. This week I put up a Quizlet for 5 more words. We're going to target those words in just a minute. I also put up the Treaties of California Tribes, so you can actually read through our treaty because we're going to be going over that. I have one more spelling test with this week's words and last week's words on it if you want. You could do just this week's words if you want, or you could try both. And remember, there's usually two versions of each word that we do. If it's a verb, we'll have the present tense and the far past. And then if it's a noun, it'll be object and subject version. So 2 versions of each word. And then we did post like a homework for those of you who are really engaging with us. If you want to write like an introduction to yourself. So some people like to introduce themselves, say what family they are, what tribe they are, who their grandparents were. So if you want to write your introduction, or you could write a prayer, and then we'll start to, looks like we did get one. And so we'll be able to work with the language team to get that translated for you. So you can have that in your like toolkit of familiar things that you could do in Chukchansi. So we're going to review now. We've done our introduction and our follow-up on last week materials. So we're going to do our creation story, like session 2 of looking at the creation story. Review our classroom rules to be encouraging. So making sure that you're, even if they're not perfect in what you're saying from, hearing from other people or saying, that it's always encouraging and that we're all working on it together. So be positive to other people and to yourself. Mistakes are okay. It's part of learning and improving. You're not going to get everything right, just as a child's not going to speak perfectly from the time that they're born. So it's okay to make mistakes. You can pause the video and do this often to echo or to work on phrases on your own, to repeat if you want to. Write what makes sense to you until you're accustomed to the new spelling used in classes, and then it'll just become second nature to you. But if writing it in a way that makes sense to, like, you're going to look back and you're going to be able to read it, then that's fine to do that. Also, daily use of language is best, so practicing something each day. If you want to put like a sticky note up somewhere that just reminding you of the word, or whether you label things around your house or whatever it is to help you stay engaged each day. These are last week's words that we targeted before we went into our story. So the first word is water, and actually remember it has a glottal stop at the beginning of all of our vowels, and that is an actual letter. So it's going to say ilik and ilka, ilik and ilka. Then for coyote, we have katyu, and katyuan. We have cover, like the verb to cover is somto and somit. And then duck is what, and what-i. For the ground or the earth, it's holgi and holgiin. And we've gone back and forth. We're still kind of figuring out if it's a K or a G, but we're going to go with G's because we know that with animals it's holgigna. So we're going to keep that consistent for right now. So holgi and holgiin. And then these are going to be our new words for this week in the story. So we're going to have the word strong, and that's jawan, jawan, and jawani, jawan and jawani. Then we have the word for like next or then or so is meetin, meetin. And the word for under or below, I guess either one, odlin, odlin. And there's not 2 forms of that one. Telling someone about something, to tell someone about something, the verb is doshit or doshto, doshit or doshto. So one of my favorite words in Chukchansi, and I say that all the time, but I really like this word for sand. It's shukshui or shukshuya, shukshui or shukshuya. So we're going to dive deep into each word in the story, and then we're going to go back through and we'll have like like a video. We actually have a really great video that Shauna and Dustin worked on of this story too. So a little variety from last week, but let's dive deep on word for word what each line says. We're going to try to get to at least the 6th line and 7th if we can get through it. So we gave the word for water and covered and world. So we should be able to match those up. So ilik is the water. Somto is the past, like far storytelling past version of the word covered. And Hityaan is the word for all or everything. And then Holkien, and that matches with the word world. And we do have it both ways in the story, so we'll kind of interrogate Holly a little bit more and see if we can nail down, is it a K or a G? Those do come up quite a bit, but we're thinking it's a G. We'll see what comes out after Fresno State talks for this week. But so coyote is katyu. Then the word for amayo matches to and. Amayo is the word for and. Then we don't need a translation for the word of a. It's just only necessary in English. We don't need it in Chukchansi. So the words like the and a are never used. We don't have a word for those. Then koliswa. Koliswa is for little. And what is for duck. The word holshachun is for sitting. So the verb holush is to sit. But if you're doing it continuously, it has that XON at the end. So chon is how we pronounce that. The X is that glottal sound. So holshachun is for sitting. Then sippin is like on top or above. And then ilkau for the water. So that's like it becomes a location when you see this W on the word water. So there's ilik and ilka. And if it has the W, it means it's happening on top of the water or to the water. So on, the word on and to and from, and those all aren't necessary to translate directly. Like we don't have a word directly for the word on because we make it a locative, which we'll get to that later. But if you're looking for which word is that to translate, it's not going to be a translation for on or a. As we move on to the next sentence, we had mian. And remember, that's the new word for this week. Mian could be for then or so or next. So mian for then. And then amak is the two of them. So it doesn't include you, two other people. Amak for the two of them. Hun to hun. Hun to hun is to wonder. So we actually put this in a past tense, but it's just like this up here, like doing it continuously. Like an ing in English, but it is past tense. So hun to hun. And then hawitmi is how. Amak is the two of them again. So it's they two. Na'ash is a word that we use for anything that's not like for certain. So could or would or should. All is part of na'ash. Then kolesta is to become small or to shrink something. Kolestal. Just like if you notice that kolestal is sort of close to koliswa, so they do have like the same root, like to become small. So if you remember, this word was little for little duck. So it's kind of related to that, to shrink or to become small. And then we have ilik or ilka for the water. Mian, so it's again talking next or so. Mian. Na'ash, like could. This one matches over here to would. So it could be could, would, should. Na'ash. Then dolol is for hills. And then tishal is to come out. Like it could do something. So when it's this tishal, when it has the AL at the end, a lot of times that comes with like na'ash, like could or maybe, like it's not for certain. So to come out is to tishal, like tishit is to come out if you're just saying it by itself, but tishal just means it could come out. So they could both eat. So then we could have done me in here again because it's the word so, but chatal amak na'ash. So they could both eat, and the two of them. And chatal means to eat, the two of them. And na'ash is that word again, the could, would, should. So now the new sentences for this week, we have Mitch Illick And just like we say mitch gais, like very good, but this is mitch ilik, so very, the water, wa'a, deep. So it kind of mixes up the word in English than we would like say directly. So mitch ilik wa'a really translates to very, water, deep. And then chuyuta, holki adlin. So holki is the earth, and then adlin is underneath. So the water is very deep, so the land was underneath it. Then we have, went to the next page. Katyu, we know that one from last week's words. Katyu is that coyote. Jawan is our word for this week, to be strong. And then your chipne is your spirit. Chipne. Then mian, ama katyu, so that coyote. And usually we have the word ama for like he, she, or it. Our pronoun is always good for any gender or whatever it is. So he, she, or it is all the same pronoun. So ama. But if you say ama before you're naming something, like in this case, we were naming the coyote, it really means that coyote. So mi and ama katyu. And then chedmachon is to be thinking, continuously doing it. So he's thinking. Doshe na, which means I will tell. I being na, and doshe is to tell. So that is our word, the verb that we got for this week. Me in, what e. So it's kind of, we're allowed to have free word order. So lots of times we like to put the verb first, then say who's doing it. So this really says tell, I tell, then duck. I will then tell duck. Machka is a command form of to get something. So he's telling him, go get shukshuya, which was our word for sand. Shukshuya. Adlin, which was under or below. Ilkau, the water. So get sand from under the water. Then he told duck dive. So mi'in for then. Ama for he. Doshto is to tell in that very far past, like storytelling past. What e, so the duck. Belka, so dive. We could say bell it, but in this form, if we put ga at the end, we're telling him to do it. Dive. So last week we heard from some of the students that I had in class, and this week we're going to play the same story, Creation of Land. This is one that Shauna and Dustin compiled for us.
Holkein the Ishantau, or Shantau Oshto, Ta Wintau Chaitash. Creation of Land, Theft of Fire, Morning Star. Translated by Honored Elder Dr. Holly Wyatt. Read by Language Apprentices Shauna Alexander and Dustin Calhoun Johnson.
Ilik somto hidyaan holgiin. Water covered all the world. Kahu ama yo koliswa what halshachon sipen ilkau. Coyote and Little Duck were sitting above the water. Mi and the mak hon hontachon hawit mi amak nash kalesta ilka. They wondered how they could reduce the water. Mi and naash dulu tishal, so the hills would show. Chatal lamak naash, so they could eat. Mitch ilik wa a chuyuta holgi adlin. The water was deep. There was land beneath it. Kahu jawan chipne. Coyote had supernatural power. Mian nama kayu chedmachon doshe na mian what e machka shukshuya adlin ilkau. Coyote was thinking, I will tell Duck, get sand from under the water. Mian nama dosto what e belga mian what belta adlin ilkau. So he told Duck, dive, and Duck went to the bottom. Me and what gaabota shukshuya amin dadachu du ponoshne. Duck grabbed some earth in his claws like hands. Mian tishmasham ilka shukshui chuita amen ponoshau. But as he came up, the sand fell out of his hands. Mian panata sipen ilka koliswa shukshui hoto adlin kheshachau. When he reached the surface, there was only a little sand left under his fingernails. Mian kahu taneta shukshuyo mian deishta apoma kayu chaneta mian naman wilchate. Coyote took this and made it into a ball. He had some seed they used to eat. Mian nama yetam chanetam chayata chaneta apomin shukshuyao. He had one, but one seed left. He put it in the ball of sand. Mian nama samia naash shawonol hidyaan haantau. That seed could make anything swell up. Shonit duyaan ilka ama neye banyu. Then that seed swelled, drawing up the water just like a sponge. Ama hit yo holki mich amna chuyu da limik ohmen op ohmen toinena op. This place, this country was dry, but it was black, no sun or moon.
So modern language history really has to do with how did we go from being fluent speakers where everyone spoke Chukchansi to where we are now in 2023 with just a few speakers left, and we're in the endangered language category. So each one of these could really be its own class session. There's so much that happened in each one of these eras, and it would be great to get feedback from all the families and all the stories that we hold within each one of our families. But for right now, it's kind of just a general, just so we could fit it in within a half an hour history. But we're going to go through all of these and learn about how language was influenced in each of these eras of history. We're going to start with 1800s, and pretty interesting to see. There's not like 100% pure evidence that this happened, but we have little clues that it happened, that there were kidnappings from the missionaries that came. And in 1770, we do have accounts in books where there was missionaries accompanied by soldiers that came over to the Shalom Tachi Indians, and they had convinced about 200 of, at least they convinced parents to give them permission to take 200 of their children to this extravagant life that they were going to give them at the missions. And of course it was, not the truth. But luckily the chief forbid it from happening. But that was documented that did occur, and like the beginning kind of entry of the Central Valley. And that's like kind of like the Bakersfield area is where that sort of happened. And then throughout history, like we know that those expeditions by missionaries couldn't have actually come this far into the valley until around the 1800 mark or later even. But what we do know is that when the different, there was a couple, like a doctor and a couple other people that made journals about their time on the battalion, there was documents in their writings that talked about how we had some fluent Spanish speakers that were Chukchansi, and the only way that would have happened is and they were also educated, is if they had been brought back to missions, and that was a common occurrence in the Central Valley to have happened. So it could be, obviously if we had fluent speaker and that they had been educated at least enough to kind of have some sense of what was going on when they did the treaty in 1851, they would have had to have been kidnapped at that time. Something else that connects our language too with this sort of history is that we have a lot of borrowed words from Spanish, and they're things that would have been introduced to us like the first time, like table, or there's a lot of livestock, like for table we say la mesa, or for livestock we say guayu, that's just a borrowed word for horse, or baliga for sheep. So it also has those influences of like the first non-Native American items that came in were Spanish adopted words. We also have another clue that Chukchansis may have become familiar with that, because there's in the ethnography, it talks about how Dick Neal describes his father's story when he was younger about being part of a raid to the Central Coast, and to know your way there and to know where to go. We would steal horses and livestock to bring back to our villages because it was meat for us. So it actually talks about an expedition where Dick Neal's father went with a group of 6 or 7 other Chukchansis, and it took him about 5 or 7 months to bring back the horses. But they engaged in, I guess once they got over the hill, they had things with them, horses with them. They let them go because they noticed that the Spanish were on the trail, and they began to get shot at by the Spanish, and they had split up, and then they hid, and they hid all day. So the Spanish ended up running out of bullets, and they still had their bows and arrows, but they ended up not being killed and reunited with the rest of their group and came back to tell the story. So kind of interesting. Here's the Mission San Miguel. This is a picture of Mission San Miguel in 1864, just a drawing done. But it's interesting because that was the group that there was that documentation in 1770s of trying to go and convince the 200 Tachis to let their children go with them. But this is kind of what it looked like over there along the coastline. Here's another drawing that was done, just kind of showing what it was like. It was definitely, if you went to the mission, you know, lots of kids are studying that in 4th grade as if it's some extravagant place and rebuilding these models. But for us, it was like our concentration camp. You know, we were treated as slaves and, you know, forced to try to, you know, be put into this new life that they thought that we were going to have. But really it was, we were overused and treated terribly there. So then there's that disease outbreak of 1833. So the first major incident that had like a devastating effect on our people didn't necessarily mean that we engaged with non-Indians. It actually could have very well come from trading with other native populations. But there was this big pandemic that happened, and it probably started in the far north, like the Washington area, and it went through fur trappers down to Hudson's Bay. And it either could have been, there's some things that say that it was malaria, and there's other things that say it's smallpox, but it definitely wiped out the majority of tribal populations. And we know about it not only because there's documents of, there's an account from some people that were able to write, you know, non-Indians, able to write about going through the valley, the Central Valley, and seeing the devastation. But also we have a place called Bone Road, and it's down by Experimental Range. And we were told that, you know, we had like a massive disease that hit us, and that we'd left, like what was left of, was it just bones, because we weren't able to keep our ceremony where we, you know, in Cry Dance, we cremate. And so many people had died that they ended up having to abandon our ceremony so that the remaining people could live, because they knew that they were catching it from everybody else. But an account by J.J. Warner, who traveled up the San Joaquin River in 1883, recounted the devastation. He put this in his book. Around the naked villages, graves and the ashes of funeral prayers, the skeleton and swollen bodies told a tale of deaths such to us no written record has ever revealed. From the head of the Sacramento Valley to until we reached the mouth of the Kings River, not exceeding 5 Indians were still seen. It was evident to us from the signs of which we saw that first the Indians buried their dead, then when the dead became so numerous that the living could not burn them, resort was had to the burning of dead bodies, and when the living diminished numbers were so unavailable to do this, they abandoned their villages, the sick and the dying, and they fled in dismay, not to die by the side of springs and pools of water beneath the shade of protecting trees. So this on the left is just it shows kind of a depiction from another area. This isn't like our picture of Chukchansis, but it shows how they just had so many people that were dying during that era. It says mission and the spread of diseases. J.J. Warner was the one who wrote that This is actually the testimony of J.J. Warner, and this is a picture that someone did of him. So it's actually 1833, 1931. So Chayao is that word for place of bones. And if you're going down towards Fresno from our tribe, it's off of Road 406 across from Experimental Range. Is supposed to be what our elders told us is the area that had that epidemic. And it would have matched because in the winter months we went where it was, as close as we could get below the snow line. So it really matches with the information that was written down by non-Indians also, that it would have been the winter of 1833. Just our elders speaking about it. I know that Jane had told me that story before about Bone Road. Sean is actually the one who has the family of Dick Neal, that side of the family in our tribe. So Hoshem was his name, was Dick Neal's father. Hoshem. You need lots of spit in your throat to say those X words first. And there was that documentation about how it gives an account. It says, once they were just about to make a halt for this purpose, stealing horses, Hoshem looked back and saw Mexicans with guns on their trail. They dropped their cloth, left the horses, and ran for cover. Hoshem and companion were trapped in a bad place. The Mexicans shot and wounded them both, but their pair of Indian arrows had arrows with which they hit several attackers, and they took turns shooting. This continued all day until the Mexicans ran out of bullets, and they asked the Indians, "What are they that they couldn't kill them or anything?" Meanwhile, the other Indians on the hill were weeping because they thought their companions had been killed. But after the Mexicans left, Hoshem and his friend came out and joined the others on the hill. So really cool story. And here's actually a picture of Dick Neal, 1920s, and he shared that story. So pretty cool that was passed on. Not a lot of stuff is always passed on because we have that rule that when someone passes away, you're not supposed to speak their name anymore or give life to, those things, those memories, because it kind of pulls them back from wherever they are in their spiritual journey. So it's pretty amazing that we still have some of these stories that were of people that had lived in the prior years. So looking back at this timeline, the disease outbreak of 1833 really dropped our population and our numbers way down, making, of course, less speakers at that time. So we're heading into this era from 33 to 51 with the treaty, where our numbers are much, much lower as we head into an era where we restart our war. So the War of 1851 was like our main war that really separated our life from when it was just our Chukchansi way of life to like a colonizer's way of life. A lot of the stage was set for that war, especially in 1850. So leading up, that year before was when we had a lot of interaction, and there was a lot of policies done by the federal government and the state to encourage war upon us. So in 1851, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was passed to allow Native Americans into forced labor or to be murdered with financial reward. The first governor of California was Peter Burnett, and he said in his first State of the State address, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct." So it is estimated that over 150,000 California Indians were murdered by settlers during this era, and thousands of Native American children were trafficked. Boys could be sold for $60 and girls up to $200. There were accounts of men who would kill Indian parents for the bounty and then take the huge profit by selling their children. This is also documented in accounts of men traveling behind battalions who were murdering California Indians during battles, then kidnapping the parentless children to sell them into servitude. In the 1862 Atlantic, California, which was a newspaper at the time, they reported little more than 100 miles from San Francisco in Mendocino County, the practice of Indian stealing is still extensively carried out. Only recently, George H. Woodman was caught near Ukiah with 16 Indian children as he was about to take them out of the county for sale. It was well known that a number of men in that region have for years made it their profession to capture and sell unfortunate juveniles. The price ranging from $30 to $150 depending on their quality. And this was written by Harrison in 1966 that found that newspaper article from the 1800s. Another example was U.S. agent George Hansen, who reported a band of desperate men have carried on a system of kidnapping for the past 2 years. Indian children were seized and carried into lower counties and sold into virtual slavery. The kidnappers follow at the heels of soldiers to seize children when their parents are murdered, to sell them at the best advantage. When there is no other way, there was a class of whites who systematically killed adults to get their children. It was in this setting that James Savage came into our Chukchansi area. In October of 1846, James D. Savage, a white man, joined the California Battalion at Sutter's Fort. He worked for the battalion for several months and met some Tulare Indians assisting the battalion. Soon, John Fremont asked Savage to move a head of cattle to a ranch that Fremont had owned in what is now present-day Mariposa County. This task brought Savage into the area for good. He also befriended a man named Jose Juarez, who was a Chowchillan chief. Jose Juarez was also a close friend of our Chukchansi chief, and spent a lot of time in our area. Sometime during this period, Savage obtained a trader's license, and he got the idea of opening a trading post in El Portal area of Mariposa County. His knack for picking up language helped him to seem more friendly to some of the natives. He appeared to give natives gifts for bits of rocks that Savage liked, which was the gold. He would entice local natives to work for his gifts. Gifts included small items, at first like a little tiny bead or a bright cloth. Eventually, natives loved to obtain blankets and boots, exchanging a pound of gold for a pair of boots or an ounce of gold for a sack of flour. Soon, some Indians in the area were willing to work as miners for Savage. In 1849, Savage opened a trading post in El Portal. This was short-lived, however, because the Amanichi of Yosemite quickly pushed Savage back. Savage then opened a post in Agua Fria, near Mariposa, California, and became more familiar with gold-rich areas in our mountains. One lucrative area for gold was present-day coarse gold along the Fresno River. Savage opened his main trading post, called the Fresno Crossing, which was his primary one. Some accounts portray Savage as having an army of Indians, bringing in so much gold he filled barrels and barrels of gold for his own profits. So here's an image of Savage's trading post in El Portal that still stands today. Of course, the one in the Fresno Crossing, which is our area, is not still standing. That did get burned down. And here's an image of Dr. Lafayette Brunel. Dr. Lafayette Brunel was on the Mariposa Battalion under Savage during the war. And it was said that Savage once said this to Dr. Brunel: "While you study books, I study men. I am not much deceived, and I perfectly understand the present situation. But let those who laugh win. If I can make good of my losses by the Indians out of the Indians, I'm going to do it. I was once the best friend to the Indian. I was the best friend that they could have. They would have destroyed me. Now that they once more call me chief, they shall build me up. I will be just to them as I have been merciful, for after all, they are but poor, ignorant beings. But my losses must be made good." So that was something that Dr. Lafayette Brunel wrote down in his journal that Savage had told him. And Savage could impress white men and Indians just because he played both sides. Some compared him to a white Indian. He had learned a lot from Indians over the years. He learned and loved to trap and hunt and fish and live with native people. He usually did not live with the settlers of the area. He always ended up taking on an Indian wife and living with the Indians. So he had picked up a lot of Native American languages along the way. And as a fluent German speaker, he knew about object and subject, which almost all the European languages don't have that. So it helped him to pick up our language because we have object and subject. So by about September of 1850, point where Savage was really trying to convince our Chukchansi people and the Chowchillans, who we were very close with and we were living right next to in villages, our villages in Coarsegold, it came to a point where Savage believed that if he took our chiefs to see what life was like in San Francisco, to see all of the white people and kind of impress them with how many white people there were, to kind of scare them, that was what he was trying to do. But in the book, The California Rangers, it states that Savage and Jose Juarez went to San Francisco for two reasons. One, to find a secure place for the storage of the gold dust. The other, to buy provisions and blankets for the different tribes who supplied them with money. So this was our chance as Native people, like Jose was following them, because we were going to turn in our gold that we had given so much to Savage over the time. So he had promised that we would have these supplies. We kind of had a lot of families that abandoned their traditional life that summer, and instead they were finding gold. So they didn't go and get acorns like they used to. They didn't, all the normal traditional things that we were doing, we went on his promise that we were going to have all these wonderful supplies that the white man could give us. So they did have barrels and barrels of gold with them. And on their arrival in the city of the Golden Gate, they were put up in a boarding house. As usual, the great landlocked bay was powered with vessels, so very impressive to Jose Juarez. It was gold rush, and the city was very vibrant, and there was a ton of trading. The streets were very busy due to all the trading that was happening in that area. The two men ended up going to a gambling house, and Jose Juarez, of course, Savage showed him, about alcohol, and Jose Juarez didn't hold back. So he was drunk at the time, but he was still with Jose in the Plaza Hotel. And Savage was known for being a gambler, and he was also under the influence of alcohol. He jumped up on the gambling tables and agreed to gamble his weight in gold. But it was really our gold. It was the Chukchansi's gold. And his weight was 160 pounds of gold. At the turn of the cards, his luck was out, and he had to pay over our supplies. That was our supply of gold. So Jose Juarez was just enraged that even though he was drunk, he knew what Savage had done to our people, totally betrayed us. So he did get in a physical fight with Savage, and then refused to speak to him the entire way home to Coarsegold. So in October, when Savage and Jose Juarez, plus the others in their party, returned home, it didn't take long for one, Savage to kind of understand that he had betrayed us. So he was sort of already a little bit paranoid about us attacking him. But it took, when everybody got back, there was a large crowd of Chukchansis and Chowchillans that were right near the trading post that Savage had. And he told them of the betrayal that he had done to the Indian people of that area, Chukchansis and the Chowchillans, because a lot of them had given up gathering, so they weren't even sure how they would make it through that winter, because what they had given Savage turned out to be for naught. So it took about 2 months. Savage kind of hid out knowing he betrayed us, and it took about 2 months before we finally gathered all of our people. We went and hid in the mountains, and Savage knew that it was a war at that point, and they attacked the trading post that was in Coarsegold, and from there on it was a war. So this is actually the map that shows the attacks. It was mostly, by the time they could find us, between when we kind of went and hid in the hills, it was December of 50. We had a big war time between March 19th and April 2nd, when the battalion was really on us. We kind of went up towards the Bass Lake area first, and then through the hills towards Mariposa Grove at that point. And then from April 13th to May 2nd, we had quite a skirmish there, somewhere around the Ahwahnee area. And then May 4th to May 17th is when the treaty was finally written up. But our people joined with the Chukchansis to evade Mariposa Battalion from March to May. And at one point, it is told through our elders that when we got to a point where we needed every able-bodied person, whether that was a woman or not, we needed to be quiet so that we could hide as best we could. So there was a point at which all the families had to leave their little ones that would cry all by themselves. And so it was, babies to toddlers. So it was told by elders that we wrapped up our babies in blankets as much as we could. And we had baskets to put some of the little ones in trees like we usually did. But we left them there, not knowing if we could go back to them because we were trying to survive and win the war. So it says the Chukchansis and the Amanichi refused to come in at the final battle. We ended up signing the first time, but those two tribes stayed out for longer, trying to advocate for all of the natives in our area. From 1850 on to 1860, it was called the extermination era, and that's when the government offered 25 cents at first per killed Indian. Then they bumped it up to $5 by 1860, and that definitely corresponds with then also the trafficking of Native kids too. So the Fresno Reservation was where we were asked to go and stay, and that we were told that we would be taken care of there. They would provide us food and they would show us how to farm. And the Fresno Reservation lasted from 1851 to 1869. 59. The Fresno Reservation was intended to teach us how to farm. However, these treaties, they were never ratified, and so funding did not follow. And a lot of our people were starving. There was many tribes there, so all the people there were starving and often ran away. And this area, it's really hard to tell, but here's the Madera area, like the city of Madera. This is really early on, so there really wasn't a lot there. But if you're on Road 400 and you're headed towards Madera, you get to like this flat spot. It was actually called the Adobe Ranch, and people also referred to it as the Fresno Farm. But we were asked to stay there for several years, and it was a place of disease and starvation. And one of our songs that is pretty common, it's called the People Song. That one is actually, it's about that time there, and it talks about, and it's sung in Chukchansi, so it says, "Where have all my people gone? I will share my bread." And so it talks about the starvation and the loss of our people there. So that brings us to 1887, the General Allotment Act. And so if you could see that the Fresno Reservation closed in 1859. So from 1859 to 1887, there was no like safe home for our Chukchansi people. And we could be on land, but there was also, you're still paid for killing an Indian. So some people would work underneath like a white rancher, or some just stayed in our own area and hoped that we could remain safe. But we definitely didn't have a spot to call necessarily ours or our own home because we were getting pushed out from all of our areas. And Central California foothill Indians were literally like the last group of, as Europeans came across our country, they, were the last like little pocket kind of natives that they were having to deal with. So they had learned not to give like a group of Indians a section of land that they have together. And so instead of giving us a reservation, they ended up giving the Dawes Act of 1887, or the General Allotment Act. And it allowed California Indians as individuals to receive plots of land for their family, with the intention, of course, that we were going to become farmers. But it also broke up families to take away that sense of community within our tribe. So we could not communicate with each other like we did before. And it definitely had a major effect on our use of language. So we weren't next to each other. We had non-Indian neighbors. We were definitely mixed up. And even like individual families, you're might have a brother or a sister, but if they're adults, they're living next to each other. Not necessarily always next to each other too, but it definitely broke up the ability for us to communicate like we had before. This moves us into 1892, the beginning of like our boarding school era. From the 1780s and on, the government used education as the main way to extinguish our culture and our language. It was definitely known as the assimilation era also. Sherman Indian School opened up near us, that would be one of the ones closest to us, in 1903, and Stewart opened up in 1890. Dozens of other small boarding schools existed throughout California, which a lot of people don't realize. That North Fork Presbyterian Mission School was the closest to our tribe and the site of major historical trauma for our Chukchansi grandparents and other local tribes too. So this is an actual picture of that boarding school. And there are lots of families who have stories about from their grandparents being sent here, or maybe their parents being sent here. I know that my grandma went to this school in North Fork, and she remembers that if you didn't have an older sibling to take care of you, that life was just very, very difficult. And when someone got sick, it was almost like you were just neglected. And there was documents of lots of abuse happening here, and it eventually did get shut down, but definitely a sad era for our people. This is a picture of Sherman Indian School early on. This is still the 1800s, so this is kind of as it was just getting started. And before it was Sherman Indian School, it went by another name first for about 20 years. So just how many kids were being housed at this school, but just how many kids were a part of this. And there's stories within families of the tribe that talk about how Indian agents would come and families were taught their kids to hide, because these Indian agents would come and without permission they would take our Chukchansi kids. And I read that when they went to these boarding schools, they weren't allowed to return home for the first 3 years. So they really emotionally and physically broke kids. And my grandma, she was entirely raised boarding schools, and both of her parents were raised in boarding schools. But she talks about every year when it came summer, she always wondered if her family even remembered that she was there to come and pick her up. So definitely that emotional awareness of feeling disconnected from your family and cut off. And then to think about that's 20 years and 20 years of being raised in a school. So if that's 2 generations, that's 40 years of not being able to have a family structure or to share your language. And all it took is one strong generation of pulling the children away, and then you've lost your language. So do it twice, and then there's no question about how did we get to this point. And there are families who really made an effort to hide out and hide their kids and try not to allow their kids to go to the boarding schools. And those are really the families that were able to keep their culture and keep their language. So thank goodness for some of those families that made that sacrifice for not being able to go to school as much, but being able to stay and be connected with their family and their tribe. So this moves us into the termination era, which was about 50 years from the last major effort that the government had made. They felt like they had given tribes enough time to get with the government program, and by 1990 the government really didn't have tolerance, and they thought, well, the best thing we could do is just eliminate all the reservations and the tribes, and they'll just have to be forced to become just like any other American. So although we had Picayune Reservation as 160 acres that was established in 1812, during the termination era, they dissolved Picayune Reservation, and we did have all these allotment lands that were left for individual families. So those were not terminated. Those became our only land base once the tribe was officially terminated during this era. Now we're to 1850 and Indian relocation. So when we're talking about language and how it's affected, so we have this era where children are pulled away to boarding schools and they lose their language and their culture. But now we're moving away so much from that. By the 50s, most of those boarding schools were really dwindling in numbers, and they were headed towards more of the local school. But what the government did do is the Indian Relocation Act of 1856, and it was intended to allow Native American resources for training and allowed short-term financial assistance and housing in urban cities like LA, San Francisco, Chicago, and other large cities. But most of the Chukchansis who did take people up on this, or the government up on this offer, went to either San Francisco or LA just because of proximity to the tribe. So although it sounds like a benefit, it was really a means of assimilating our people further. So the funds ran out quickly. It seemed like a lot of money. We lived in a rural location and money was hard to come by. So when the government offered this 6-month chunk of money, it sounded like it was a good deal. But what it often did is it left people stuck in urban areas without the resources to easily return. And it drew families away from their culture and their language as well. So if we're sending these Native American men and women in to, again, try to have a training or education, it's pulling them away from their people again. So when the boarding schools weren't working, we're going to try something else. So the intention of the government would be for these people to not return to their tribes, to become part of the urban life that a lot of non-Indians were living. And so there's 2 pictures on here, and these are both, the picture on the left is a picture of people in LA. They were getting off the bus from the reservation. They came out to LA all together. And then the one on the right is a picture of the Indian Center in San Francisco. Left is a picture trying to depict like how happy these people are to be away from the reservation and how they're getting all this training and they seem so joyful. This is a picture of the LA area, and then on the right, again, it's a older picture of the Indian Center in San Francisco. Other struggles that continued from the 1960s on, especially through the 1960s and 70s, was that a lot of women, especially unwed women, had to fight very hard to keep their children. And so throughout the 1800s, there are many stories within our own tribe of Chukchansi women having to hide their children, either from boarding school agents or from social service agents or from other officials trying to take their children to be adopted out against the will of the mother. And in the 70s and 80s, Indian Health Service and other physicians were known to sterilize Native American women to keep them from having their family. And ICWA was put into law. Indian Child Welfare Act was put into law in 1870. It acknowledged the separation of Indian children from their families. So we begin to have an upside to this story. In 1983, when Tilly Hardwick, her lawsuit fighting for the right of her child to go to school, it allowed our tribe to be restored. In December 22nd of 1983, she won her case, and it restored the rancheria. And from there, we have a government, and then that brought us to the point where we could have our own source of income with the casino. And that was really the first time that we opened up our own education, where we could develop our own speakers and have our own culture without anyone telling us what to do. So we were down to less than a dozen fluent speakers by 2004. And that's really where we get into that endangered language category. But we can all do our part now to learn our language and do right by our ancestors and try to bring that back as much as we can. Thanks for sticking with me through that modern language history. And just to review really quick the words for the week, which we already gave you earlier, but we're going to review them one more time. We have the words in the blue that are our words of the week. So we had Jawan and Jawani for strong, Meetin for then, Adlin for under. To tell someone about something was Doshit or Doshto. Sand was Shukshoy or Shukshuya. So now the mini spelling test in easel. Time for our spelling test. So this is going to be available for you to do in Google Classroom on your own, but if you want to do it right now and just practice one time, we have the first 5 words that are the words for this week. Then we have review of last week. And last week we just had the object form of words. No, we just had the subject form of words. So this time I mixed it up, and you might get an object or you might get a subject form of the word. So we'll start with the first word for this week, though. Jawan, Jawani. So you could choose either one of those and just write down your answer either on a piece of paper or whatever you have near you. So that was Jawan, Jawani. So that was the word for strong. Then this was the next one we had. Mian, Mian. So that was the word for under or so or next or then. Adlin, Adlin. So that was for under. Doshit or doshto. Doshit or doshto. And that was the word for cover. Shukshoy, shukshoya. Shukshoy or shukshoya. All right, and just to review, I'm going to show our words one more time. You can see how you did. So here were the words from the spelling test. And something that you really got to try to remember is that we never have a word begin in a vowel. So if you want to try to start a word and there's a vowel in front by itself, you'll know that you're misspelling it, because every vowel has a glottal, or every time you think you have just a vowel in the front, there's a glottal stop there. So like Adlin, you're always going to have that glottal stop in front. And then also in Shukshoy, it has a Y that has a glottal stop in the end. And we'll get to know this a little bit more once we finish our alphabet, when we study our alphabet next. But just remember that Shukshui has this glottal stop, and it's not the same type, right? It's more like, it looks like an apostrophe. The other one that has a glottal stop in it is Mi'in. Mi'in. Just that form. And just the form that has past tense for our verb to tell someone about something, doshto, that has a glottal stop if you're using the past tense form. The present tense, or like just happened form, it doesn't have that. So those are just a few little tricks to remembering those words for your test. Mitch guys for joining me for another Chukchansi language class, and I hope to see you next week.